for those of you that were here for my last presentation, you'll know that, as is my wont, I'd like to give an acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge all the people who've come to this country in the last 250 or so years, whose dedication, commitment, hard work and sacrifice have made Australia the great country it is today. A lot has been written, filmed, spoken and said about the war in Vietnam, but there are some facts that remain quite nebulous. A number of countries fought in the ground war, and it was a ground war, an horrific ground war. Apart from the United States, of course, there was a Republic of South Vietnam, Thailand, Korea, Australia and New Zealand. But in the naval component of the war in Vietnamese waters, only one other navy besides the US Navy participated, and that was the Australian Navy. The Australian government allocated a squadron of destroyers to the US 7th Fleet to serve in Task Force 77 off the coast of Vietnam. I'd like to talk to you about that naval component, a little known naval component. To understand the naval war in Vietnam, you have to understand the history of what happened here. Without going into great detail, after World War II, the French came back to what they called French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, part of Thailand, and they wanted their colonies back. But the people in those countries said, no, we've had quite a good bit of autonomy under the Japanese and we don't want you back. And the French decided to send in their army, and in 1954, in a decisive battle at a town called Dien Bien Phu, the French army was roundly defeated and the French withdrew from Vietnam. The United Nations in 1955 divided the country into two along the 17th parallel. And they called it the DMZ, or as we would say, the DMZ, the Demilitarised Zone, centred on the Qua Viet River, 10 miles either side. To the north, the communist-oriented government was led by two men, an academic by the name of Ho Chi Minh, which was not his real name. Ho Chi Minh actually means an exalted leader, so it was a self-appointed title, and his deputy, a fellow called Vo Nguyen Giap. Giap was the commander of the military. He was a school teacher, and he masterminded the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu. He also masterminded the war in Vietnam. In the south, they held so-called free elections, and a president called Ngo Dinh Diem was elected. Diem was very nepotistic. Of the 103 members of his cabinet, 95 of them were direct family members. And it was an extremely corrupt government. The North Vietnamese had a very good, well-organised, experienced military. The South had a series of warlords who had their own armies. They fought amongst each other. And the North Vietnamese thought this is a good idea for us to take over the southern part and reunite Vietnam. Vietnam, by the way, is a Chinese word. Viet meaning south, Nam meaning China. So they regarded themselves as South China. Now the North Vietnamese government, Giap, knew that he could not defeat the South or the Americans in any way other than to run a guerrilla war, and he did that. There was continual rage into South Vietnam, and the Americans became quite concerned because they had a lot of interest there. They had an oil facility at Da Nang. They had rubber plantations around Pleiku. But the South Vietnamese warlords were too busy fighting each other to protect the American interests. So the Americans sent a detachment of Marines under the command of a fellow called Philip Caputo, who established defensive perimeters around American facilities. And not only did they fight the North Vietnamese, they were also fighting some of the South Vietnamese, who thought, you're not paying us enough money. The Americans gave the Vietnamese a number of patrol boats called the Nasties. They ran out of Da Nang. They would run up the coast and attack facilities along the coast. causing quite a bit of damage. The North Vietnamese resisted this by having a series of patrol boats, a number of patrol boats, P4s and P6s from Russia. And they were based on an island called Hon Mi in the central Gulf of Tonkin. And whenever the nasties came up, they would come out and a battle would ensue. In August 1964, an American destroyer called the USS Maddox sailed into the Gulf of Tonkin and was patrolling 22 nautical miles off the coast when the South Vietnamese launched a nasty boat raid against the North. The North retaliated, but they also saw this ship that they thought was part of the attack and attacked the Maddox. The Americans were very concerned, and they started launching airstrikes against the patrol boat bases at Hon Mi and Hon Quo. But it was decided we needed an organised structure to fight against the Vietnamese. And so they established Task Force 77, a group of ships that were going to be operating in Vietnamese waters to support the growing ground war in South Vietnam. The operations to the north of the demilitarised zone were called Operation Sea Dragon. To the south, they were called Operation Market Time. Sea Dragon was designed as an offensive operation to take the war directly to the North Vietnamese, to bombard targets within the North Vietnamese mainland. Market Time was to prevent the infiltration by small boats into South Vietnamese waters. In addition, the Americans started the air war against North Vietnam called Operation Rolling Thunder that ranged from 1965 to 1968. Rolling Thunder was operated out of Thailand, and there were 4 main bases: Tak Ly, U Bon, U Don and Nakhon Phanom. Nakhon Phanom was right on the border of Laos, and I remember seeing a sign over the gate going into Nakhon Phanom Air Base that said, "Welcome to Nakhon Phanom, 45 minutes from Hanoi." They were the reconnaissance aircraft. Tak Ly were the B-52s. To supplement the air war, the Navy established Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin. Yankee Station was so called because they drew on a chart a 200 nautical mile diameter circle and divided it into 3, which looked like a big Y, phonetic Yankee. In each area of Yankee Station was a carrier battle group. One carrier would fly from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m, the other one from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. I didn't use military time there in case somebody didn't know. The third carrier flew 24/7. Also established right up in the Gulf of Tonkin was PIRAZ, Positive Identification Radar Area Zone. This was to be a ship that had a big radar fit that could cover the entire area of the Gulf of Tonkin, China, Hainan, North Vietnam and half of South Vietnam. Talos. Now Talos is a missile. In their inventory at that time, the Americans had 3 missiles. Tartar, which was a short range, 25 nautical mile surface to air missile. Terrier, medium range, about 60 miles. And Talos, a long range, about 140 miles. Massive big missiles. They combined that because the Talos ships would naturally have a large radar fit. Also working with PIRAZ were the 2 sea air rescue stations, Northern SAR and Southern SAR. These were there to pick up pilots that had to ditch. During the course of the Vietnam War, the United States Air Force, Army and Navy lost 10,400 aircraft. That's a lot. The planes coming out, both Air Force and Navy coming out over the coast, if they had the bailout, they were picked up by Northern SAR and Southern SAR. To the south, around Saigon, was an area known as Rung Sat. This was a very large, marshy, swampy area, and the colloquially called Viet Cong stronghold. They entrenched themselves into there. I might point out the Viet Cong were only a small factor in the war. The bigger factor was the North Vietnamese Army. On the Delta was Operation Sea Lords. The Americans love acronyms. Sea Lords stood for Sea, Air, Land, Ocean, Rivers, Deltas and Streams. And this was a lot of patrol boats, small craft that ran through the canals and the swampy, marshy areas down in the Delta. During the run of the Vietnam War, I did 2 tours on board a destroyer called the Perth. And each tour you would do around about 30 days, what we called on the gun line. You'd be up in the Gulf of Tonkin or down on the gun line. And then you'd have a port call, back for another 30 days and a port call. And this would go on for quite a while. The Perth was assigned to the 7th Fleet from 1967 to 1971. The very last tour I did on the Perth, we did as part of Operation Sea Lords. I might add that the Perth was the last Australian naval ship to be struck by enemy gunfire. The Army had divided the country into 4 groups, 1, 2, 3 and 4 Corps, although one Corps they called I Corps. These were operational areas. Each had their own operational headquarters, each ran their own operations, and each was a different type of country. There was the open plains, there was the jungle, there were the highlands, and there was the delta. And the ships, particularly the destroyers, were assigned to what we'll call H&I and NGS. NGS is Naval Gunfire Support. You would have spotters, aircraft or on the ground. They would call in targets, you would do a shoot. It would be a controlled shoot. You'd fire 1 or 2 rounds for ranging. Then you'd be called to do what we call the dump, where you put probably up to 100 rounds into a target. These are 5-inch shells, I might add. Each one would take your house to the moon. But, and I will point out that during my first tour, 68-69, we fired close to 20,000 rounds. Changed the gun barrels about 6 times. H&I's harassment and interdiction, targets of opportunities. As soon as someone saw something happening, you'd be called in and do a dump on them. It was a 24/7 operation, so there was no respite. The crews were closed up constantly. You were also under fire from shore batteries. You did not do a tour in the Sea Dragon without coming back with some damage. The whole operation, as far as the Navy was concerned, was run out of Subic Bay in the Philippines. In the left centre, you see Cuby Point, the Naval Air Station, with the carrier tied up alongside. To the right is the main naval base, Alava Pier and Rivera Pier. To the bottom is Alligator Creek, which is the amphibious section, and on the very bottom is what was called Comserve Train, the Commander Service Forces Pacific that would resupply. This is a relatively recent photograph of Subic Bay. In the days of when I was there, in the background there would be at least 40 merchant ships at anchor offloading goods, and out in the main stream would be 2 destroyer tenders, each one with about 6 or 8 destroyers swinging off them. It was a very, very big operation. Yankee Station. Now, destroyers were assigned to Yankee Station as what we call plane guard. You sit behind the carrier in case there's an accident, either launching or landing, you're there to pick somebody up. The carriers flew quite strenuous missions, sometimes up to 90 sorties a day. The first carriers on station were what were known as the Essex class aircraft carriers. Now these were World War II carriers. They also served in Korea. But during the 50s and early 60s, a lot of them underwent a really huge modification program to fit an angled deck, hurricane bow, remove the World War II guns and so on. These carried F-8 Crusaders and A-4 Skyhawk attack aircraft, but they were a small carrier in the scheme of things, 900 feet in length, about 46,000 tonnes, and they would carry about 45 aircraft. They were soon replaced by the big Midway and Coral Sea. These carriers were commissioned in the years straight after the war, again underwent major modifications, and they operated aircraft such as the F4 Phantom, A7 Corsair II, and one we call the Iron Tadpole, the A6 Intruder. They would be flying constantly, and you can see there the plane guard right behind them. They're down there about 2,500 yards behind them. Then came the first of the super carriers, that's the USS Kitty Hawk, about 85,000 tonnes, 1,000 feet in length, and she carried around about 75 aircraft. As you can see here, she's got Phantoms, Sky Warriors, Corsairs, and on the stern you'll see, with the wings folded, a group of A1 Sky Raiders. These were known as the Lilos, linger and loiter aircraft. They were propeller driven. They'd served well in Korea and they served well in Vietnam as being able to get over the target and fly low and long. They would be on station for hours, and they were good spotters as well. They called in your gunfire supports. And then of course the Enterprise rolled up, world's largest warship, 1,123 feet in length, 100 aircraft, 95,000 tonnes. Very big carrier. And I served with them all. You served with them all. You're right behind them as they were launching. You would only be there a few days and then you'd move on to somewhere else. And wherever the carriers went, so went a ship we called Gargles. Gargles were Russian trawlers. I don't think they ever caught a fish. They were full of electronic gear. They were listening to the Americans. You see this one here, of no doubt, after this photograph was taken, he turned to starboard and tried to cross the bow of the carrier to force them to break off their replenishment. But as we know, the international rule of the sea, an aircraft carrier and flying operations has a right of way over everything. So a couple of these Gargles got run over. The other thing also was another ship would come, and I've been in situations like this where we'd come in between the carrier and Gargles and you hit them with a fire hose. They didn't like that. They also would get behind the carrier and try to impede the rescue destroyer behind, so incoming aircraft coming back from the mission would dump excess fuel on top of them. So they stopped doing it. Now this is a photo I took myself, and this photo has a tremendous story to it. This is around Christmas, 68, we're heading north, going up into the Gulf with the Kitty Hawk battle group. You can see the Kitty Hawk in the background. In the right foreground is a missile cruiser called the Fox, and in the left side of the picture you see the big World War II vintage cruiser, the USS Oklahoma City, flagship of the US 7th Fleet. We were stopping off at Yankee Station, drop off the carrier, and then headed up to northern and southern SAR. We were sailing up the coast, based around the OK City. I drew a 5 nautical mile circle around it. Off the starboard bow was us, port bow was the Fox, port quarter was a destroyer called the Higbee, and starboard quarter was another destroyer called the Hollister. We were 14 miles off the coast. As you do, before we got on station, we had to fire the guns to make sure everything was working. The Higbee fired their after gun mount and had what we call a hang fire. A live round failed to exit the gun barrel. Pretty tickly situation. The crew evacuated the gun mount and sheltered in the after superstructure. They would have to wait there for 15 minutes before they could cool the turret down. The Oklahoma City told the Higbee to move to 8.5 miles away. So she was now 13 miles out from the carrier, pretty close to the coast. All of a sudden, out from the coast came 2 MiGs flying right on the deck. One of them dropped a bomb on the Higbee, which blew the after gun mount off. Saved them having to clear the hang fire, I guess. The second one, and then they turned around and went back, but the second MiG was heading straight for the OK City, and the Fox shot it down with a Terrier missile. We fired a Tartar missile at the second, or the first one that had hit the Higbee, but by then the plane was close to the coast at 20 miles range. The missile detonated, it damaged the aircraft but didn't bring it down. That aircraft today sits on a pedestal in Hanoi as the aircraft that sank an American destroyer. The Higbee went back to Subic Bay for repairs, and they just removed what was left of the aftergun and welded on a big circular plate on the deck, and the crew, being jokers that they were, painted a big red and white target on it. Now Fliers and Talos, as I said, they were big ships. This is the USS Little Rock, which is a World War II vintage cruiser that had been converted to a Talos missile cruiser. Look at the size of those missiles on the quarterdeck. You can see the men standing around. They're huge big missiles. They weigh about 1.5 tons, maybe a bit more. The guns on this, they had 6-inch guns and 5-inch guns, but they were used mainly for their Talos missiles. They would have an escort with them as well. USS Chicago, another one of the Fliers Talos ships. This is again a World War II cruiser. In the 1950s, was stripped to the hull and rebuilt as a missile cruiser. She had no guns on board. She had twin Talos missiles fore and aft and twin Tartar missiles either side of the bridge. President Kennedy was aboard the ship and watched it do a missile firing, and it missed the target, and he instructed the ship be fitted with guns. So they put a 50 caliber machine gun on the back of the bridge. And then the Long Beach, the world's first nuclear powered warship. A lot of firsts and lasts for the Long Beach. It was the last cruiser built on a World War II cruiser hull. First nuclear powered warship in the world. The last warship to have a wooden deck. She carried 2 twin Terrier launchers forward and a twin Talos aft. On the bridge you see the big planar arrays of their radar system. That had a range of around about 800 nautical miles up to 200,000 feet. Big dome. After a while it became apparent that the destroyers were not the suitable ships for the sea air rescue stations. Every one of them that served on the sea air rescue stations was damaged and hit by enemy gunfire. You'd have to get close to the coast to pick up these pilots. Some of them were very inconsiderate to get themselves shot down right close to the coast. You'd have to get right in. The top ship is a Lehigh class cruiser, double-ended, with Terrier missiles fore and aft. The bottom one is a Belknap with a 5-inch 54 caliber gun aft. They were very effective sea air rescue ships because the Vietnamese wouldn't bring aircraft anywhere near them with their big missile fits, but they still also got hit a bit. Now the gunfire support, this took many forms. The initial ships were the old Gearings, World War II vintage destroyers, 6 5-inch guns. They were very good ships, very powerful ships during World War II, but during a modern war, they just did not have the firepower. The guns only had a range of about 12 nautical miles, so they had to get very close to the coast, as you can see here. And they would get hit by shore batteries quite regularly. With the air war going on in North Vietnam, the American government decreed that they didn't want to be seen as targeting civilians. So all urban areas had a 10-mile circle drawn around them and you weren't allowed to go inside that circle. The Vietnamese suddenly realised this and started to move all their missile batteries and gun batteries inside those 10-mile circles so they couldn't be attacked. There was an American pilot named Michael Estosin who was shot down by a SAM over North Vietnam, and as he said, over his previous 3 missions he'd watched them build the SAM site that shot him down. He couldn't do anything. Because of their limited firepower, the newer destroyers were brought in. The top one is a Forrest Sherman, 3 5-inch 54 caliber semi-automatic guns. Those 5-inch guns could pop out around about 30 rounds a minute. The bottom is an Adams class destroyer. Now these are the kind of ships the Australian Navy had. 2 5-inch 54 caliber automatic guns. They could fire 45 rounds a minute. And you did. They were banging away day and night. Missiles aft in the Tartar missile system. I consider them the most beautiful warships ever built. And that's my old ship, that's the Perth. In 1968, as you can see, the after gun mount and the after missile launcher. We only had a single rail launcher. Hanging over the stern above the D, you'll see a tube. That is called the garbage chute. That's what we used to do in those days. With a garbage can, you'd go down there and throw it into the chute to go down into your wake. You can't do that now, of course. And there's a shot of the Perth actually firing on North Vietnamese positions. This is taken from a cruiser called the Newport News, which I'll come to in a moment. The Americans wanted more firepower, so they brought in some World War II vintage 8-inch gun cruisers, and each cruiser had an escort called the Shotgun, and the Perth was Newport News' Shotgun, and we went everywhere with her. She'd do shoots against the main targets, we'd be engaging the shore batteries, and they'd be engaging us. There is the Newport News. Big World War II cruiser, 9 8-inch guns, 12 5-inch 38 caliber guns. He carried some firepower, I tell you. And of course, the St. Paul. She was one of the flagships. She again had 9 8-inch guns, but she only had 8 5-inch guns because she operated as a flagship more than as a gunship. A flagship. Okay, with any group, Task Force 77, you break it down into groups. Task Group 77.1, 77.2 and so on. And the task group would have a flag who's a senior ranking officer, and he would come on board with his staff, all the lackeys and so on, and they would require accommodation, they would require a separate bridge area where they could make their command decisions and pass them to the command of the ship, which is on the lower bridge. Of course, the smaller ships never had these facilities. We never had the accommodation space or the spare bridge as the big cruisers did. So you can see he's flying a flag there, that red flag. That indicates he's got his flag officer on board. So we'd stay away from them because they like to nitpick. And then, of course, in 1968, they recommissioned the USS New Jersey, a World War II battleship. She had 9 16-inch guns, 25-inch guns. Well and good commissioning this ship as a good gunship. She'd sit 20 miles off the coast and bombard targets 5 miles inland. But when they commissioned it, they had no one who could fire the guns. So they formed a group of people. In the American Navy, the various groups, engineering, seamen, electrical, whatever, they're called divisions. And on the New Jersey, they had what they called the Pop Division. And these were old retired sailors that had fired 16-inch guns. They're all in their 50s and 60s. They're tremendous old blokes. They knew what was going on, and they fired these guns. She was a big asset. Boy, you know, the ground would shake when she had bullets hitting the ground. I would find out that apart from the carriers and the big gunships, every destroyer that served up on Sea Dragon was struck by enemy gunfire, damaged in some way. And it really caused a bit of consternation amongst the US. Their Navy chiefs, they didn't think these people would fire back at you, but I can assure you they did. And it was always a bit of a break if you got a few days down on market time down in the southern section. The market time operation, as I say, was aimed at preventing North Vietnamese small boats coming into South Vietnam with weapons and personnel. And the patrol duties fell to some of the old destroyer escorts. Now these are old World War II vintage ships. They were all built 1943 to 45, but they did undergo major overhauls to be put onto the line here, and they served quite well. This is a World War II escort, the USS Calcaterra. She has 2 3-inch pop guns, but they were good for stopping small boats. The Knox class frigates were even better because they had the 5-inch 54 calibre gun forward, but they carried a helicopter, and the helicopter could chase them down and shoot them up, which they did do. And then, of course, the US Coast Guard got involved. They came into the southern area, particularly around the Delta and around Three Corps. They were very good. They obviously knew how to operate inshore, and their main duty was to stop the transfer of personnel from one area to the other by boat, and they did that very effectively. There was one instance where they stopped the boat that had, I'll never forget this, they had a group of Vietnamese soldiers they'd captured, and they brought them out to us. We didn't know what to do with them. So we sat them down on the quarter deck, and along comes this little boat with these couple of guys on it, and they said, we're going to take them off your hands. I said, righto. And this guy got out to the Vietnamese, and he said to them, spoke to them in Vietnamese, and from what I can gather, he was saying, asking them, where they were from, what they were doing, and so on. And they didn't say anything. So he grabbed one of them, held him up against the side, and fired a pistol. And this guy went over into the water, and we thought, geez, kill him. And these guys had to torture him to shut them up. So they put him in the boat, and this other guy clambers back over the side, and he said, next time, he said, you get shot. It was a little pantomime no stage, but it had the desired effect. Now we come to the Delta area. This was a very, very dangerous area. So I can show you a few of the areas we worked on. There is Saigon, the main city of Saigon there. That is the Rung Sat, the special zone. This is the Delta. This area is called Honda Back. You can see all the canals that are in there. And this down here is the U Minh Forest. And there were quite a large contingent of Vietnamese that had got down into there, and we had to go and winkle them out. And it's not an easy job. Part of the task force were the riverine forces. These are the main patrol boats you see that we saw in Vietnam. You see in the movies they're different. These ones are called swift boats, and the Americans had probably around about 70 or 80 of these running around through the Delta area. They carried 2 twin 50 calibre machine guns and an 81mm mortar. They were seriously fast. They could scoot around the river estuaries and the canals and so on. The smaller boats that they used, the pibbers, these were mainly used up in the Rung Sat or around the marshy areas. They didn't have propellers, they had a Lycoming jet engine in them. And they would race around, they could scream across the sandbars and so on. But they were very light. They were made out of fiberglass, and I've seen a helicopter pick one of these up and take it away. And, well, that's the way you want to move. Of course, in the canals area, the Vietnamese would hide in the dense undergrowth along the banks of the canal, and the Americans wanted them out of there, and they brought in monitors. Now this is just a barge with an engine in it, a superstructure made out of metal, and they carry a flamethrower, and they would just cruise down the canals and burn off all the vegetation along the edge of the canal, so there was nowhere for them to hide. You could smell these things. It was just like a petrol smell in the air. Of course, the South Vietnamese Navy came to the show. They had a couple of old minesweepers they chugged around with, but they didn't do too much. They didn't like to get involved in the action. If the shooting started, they would be gone very quickly. This was a big operation, and the ships needed to be replenished. Running out of Subic Bay was the service forces to resupply the ships. Tankers, ammunition ships, store ships would all be coming out of Subic Bay. They would sail out of Subic, head due west until they got to a point about 20 nautical miles off the coast of Vietnam, then they'd head north. They go north straight up to the Yankee station, turn around and come back. By the time they got back to the initial turn position, they were empty. Then they'd head east into Subic Bay for a top-up. We did an ammunition every second day. And every second ammunition you did a fuel and stores. You can see here there's an aircraft carrier and a destroyer alongside a tanker with 2 more destroyers in the queue. That's what would happen. You'd send off what we call a shopping list. You say we want this many bullets, we want this much food, this much fuel, whatever. And you get a signal back saying go to this position and meet this ship. And out you'd go, and they'd have it there waiting for you. But sometimes you had to get in the queue. You had to wait for them. It was a bit of entertainment, this, because the tanker or the store ship would have a band on board and they would be playing. And they never called it, the Americans called it an underway replenishment or an unrep. We call it a RAS, refuel at sea. But in this particular instance, they referred to it as the serenade. And we get the signal, serenade, and we'd come up alongside and they'd have their band playing. They'd play everything from classic to jazz to country and western, whatever. And every ship then had a breakaway song. When you finished, you'd break the lines and you'd head off at full speed, and you had an unrep flag, which was a big flag. You'd unfurl and you'd play your unrep song. And some of them were pretty good. Our unrep flag was a big blue flag, and it had on it a kangaroo standing there with his legs astride and his arms up, and he's got a pair of boxing gloves on, and he had a pair of shorts that were an American flag, and it had on it American built, Australian perfected. And then we'd play Ghost Riders in the Sky, and away we'd go. And the Yanks loved it. They'd stand there and applaud. But the replenishment ships themselves did the hard yards. They were there all day, every day. There's an ammunition ship, that's the USS Kilauea. All the ammunition ships are named for volcanoes. I remember saying to one of the guys on the Haleakala, one of the ammunition ships, aren't you worried if you get hit? And he said, not at all, we'll just go a little bit higher. And these things carried about 8,000 tonnes of ammunition. All sorts of ammunition, from 3-inch, 5-inch shells to 9mm bullets, 50 calibre bullets, to missiles for the big cruisers if they needed them. And even weapons for the aircraft on the carriers. This is the USS Mars. She's a combat store ship. They're all named for planets. This brought a new era of replenishment, unrepping. You can see it's got the big standpoints for the lines. You'd come alongside, put a line across, they'd hook it onto their hard point and lift it up. You'd have a wire rope and down would come the hoses. And they'd just connect on, start fueling. They introduced what we call a VERTREP, vertical replenishment. Here you can see a C-9 helicopter, a bullfrog, lifting a pallet off the quarterdeck. And that'll bring it across to the ship and drop it on the ship. Saves having to send a lot of stuff over by, and they could replenish a couple of ships at a time doing this, one either side and a helicopter flying around. Of course, fuel was up the tankers. I like the American tankers. They all had the name of an Indian river, or Indian river names. There was Mispillion, Saugatuck, Mackinaw, Hassayampa, Posompsic. They all had romantic names. This is the Kawishwi, which is a big tanker. These were purpose-built to run to Vietnam, because prior to this, a lot of their tankers were World War II tankers. They simply cut them in half and put a 100-foot section in the middle and filled them up with oil. But these tankers were magnificent ships. They carried 148,000 gallons of fuel. So if your tank was empty, they were the guys to fill you up. This is the Roanoke. Now the Roanoke, again, had everything on it. Fuel, ammunition, food, you name it. Fly helicopters off. There's trucks parked up on the flight deck. That's how they'd get the goods up onto the flight deck. Trucks would drive through the ship and pick them up. Very, very big ships. and the Camden. There's the latest one. The Camdens have just gone out of service just recently, and these were big ships. These were around about the 50,000 tonne mark. Again, they carried everything. One of the things you do when you come alongside and you've got the high lines across, they would hang a blackboard or a board over the side with the movies they had on board. One time we came alongside and they hung across a sign that said they had 3 movies. There was a detective movie, a murder mystery, a western, and Alice in Wonderland. So the movies came across, the officers took the detective movie, the chiefs and petty officers took the western, and the junior sailors were left with Alice in Wonderland. And we thought, we don't want to watch this. But there's no movie, so we decided we'd watch it one night. And it was a soft porn movie. And from then on, the officers and the chiefs were banging at our doors. You know, we want to swap movies. No way, no way. Another thing they do is hang over a list of all the ice cream flavours they have. So you could say, you know, we want this one, we want that one. This is where I first learned what a pistachio nut was. But they were big ships, very big ships. Also, very sad ships. There were 2 hospital ships, the Sanctuary and the Repose. They had 2,000 beds on board and they were always full. Very sad ships. We come alongside. They never serenaded them. They would just come alongside, take on the fuel, stores, whatever, and go. We like coming alongside them because you might get a glimpse of the nurse. But I don't know. They seemed, the nursing corps in those days, I'm sorry ladies, but they seemed to recruit them by the kilo. So we never bothered. All the ships that served in the Gulf of Tonkin automatically became members of the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club. I have my patch at home on a jacket. It's an exclusive club. There's only about 30,000 members. There are a number of ships that serve. Task Force 77 comprised 1 battleship, USS New Jersey, 18 cruisers, 142 destroyers, 44 destroyer escorts, 10 store ships, 14 ammunition ships, 22 tankers, and 2 hospital ships. So it wasn't a small operation. We couldn't berth all these ships at one port at one time. The usual tour of duty, you'd arrive in Subic Bay, you get the weight, which is just a handover, then off you go. You'll go out onto the gun line or to Yankee Station or to Sea Dragon. You'll be there for 30, 35 days. Off you go, somewhere like Hong Kong, Singapore, Bangkok, and or Taiwan, particularly like Keelung. You'd be in there for about 5 or 6 days for R&R, then back on the line. But you made a lot of good friends, and we all knew each other. We all had the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club badge, and yeah, it was a pretty close group. Well, no story is complete without statistics. 1,842,000 United States Navy personnel served in Vietnam. Not only crews of ships, but the pilots, the helicopters, the store ships, everything. 13,500 Australian Navy personnel served in Vietnam. Not only the warships, the helicopter flight Vietnam, the Australian diving teams, what we call MACVs, the Military Assistant Command Vietnam. They were like Army instructors, Air Force instructors, Navy instructors, and so on. 3,600 naval personnel were killed, including a number of Australians. I joined the Navy with a fellow a very nice guy, came from Queensland, and I'd gone up to Queensland to his house for a part of my leave, and we were driving back to Sydney, and we were halfway out in the middle of nowhere, and we were listening to the radio, and it came over the radio that a helicopter pilot had been killed, and it was his brother. Jeez. And I didn't know what to do, so I just drove on in silence. And 10,000 Navy personnel were wounded. That doesn't take into account the psychological effect as well. You go up there, you're 18, 19, you're 10 foot tall and bulletproof, and you come out of there quite cynical, I'll tell you that. It's not what you see in the movies. But it was an experience, and it's an experience I'm glad that I had, because it's what you do. You spend all this time training and training and training, and then bang, you're doing the real thing. Might take 5 minutes to get the ship to action stations during a training drill, but I'll tell you what, it'll take you about 5 seconds when the real thing's gone, because you start to move. And it was a great experience, and I don't regret 1 minute of it. This is quite prophetic. No event in American history, or even Australian history, is more misunderstood than the Vietnam War. It was misreported then, and it's misremembered now. Steve would know, I gave a talk to the Military History Society, and I said to them, if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you're misinformed. Yes. Rarely have so many people been so wrong about so much, and never have the consequences of their misunderstanding been so tragic. And that was Richard Nixon. And I have to agree with his sentiments. I thought I'd finish with a shot of an aircraft carrier. You'd all like the aeroplane sitting on this. Yep. This is an aircraft carrier called the Bonhomme Richard. Darwin. Commonly referred to as the Bonnie Dick. She was one of the carriers we served with, and very effective. So do we have any questions on what we've covered? Yes, sir.
How could America lose the war?
I would refute that and say they didn't lose the war. The Americans left Vietnam in 1973 having achieved what they wanted to do, and that was to stop the North Vietnamese in South Vietnam. But not only Vietnam, but Afghanistan. You see in a lot of the wars today, or a lot of the conflicts today, that a smaller antagonist can overcome a numerically and technologically superior enemy by making them fight on their own terms. The Afghans did that. Drag them into Afghanistan, make them fight on horseback, make them throw rocks at each other. I don't say the Americans lost Vietnam, the Vietnamese lost Vietnam because they had no will. When Diem was assassinated in '63, they had a series of venal and slothful presidents, ending up with a fellow called Nguyen Cao Ky, who now owns a liquor store in San Diego. They were only interested in lining their own pockets. They weren't interested in fighting the war. The Americans pumped billions and billions and billions of dollars into there, and a very small percentage of it got to where it should have gone. You've got to learn from that. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the 22 tankers.
Yes.
How far they'd have to go afield to refuel themselves?
They had a good range. They had a range of about 13,000 miles, so they could come out from Subic, across up to Yankee Station, go back to Subic, where they would then themselves refuel and be reloaded. Yes, sir.
My late eldest brother, Rodney, served on the Vampire and went up into Vietnam. And
no, the Vendetta.
Vendetta, was it?
The Vendetta went to Vietnam.
Began with the V, anyway. Yeah. He was also a clearance diver. So,
right, yeah.
So I wish he was here to hear you talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
You spoke quite extensively last time about submarines.
Yes,
And we all took it that you were a submariner.
yes.
How did this fall on from that? An interest in the Navy, I would say.
Once upon a time, I was 17, believe it or not. Fresh-faced young individual, and I decided to join the Navy. I spent the best part of 18 months on an old destroyer called the Duchess. I was then posted to the Perth and spent the better part of 3 years on her, during which I did the 2 tours. In 1971, the war was winding down, and I could see it was going to be a boring few years ahead. I had already volunteered for the submarine service, and so I saw my divisional officer and said, "What's the news?" And he said, "Well, you're off to England tomorrow." Oh, good. So I joined submarines in 1971 and served until 1998. And I don't regret it. Do it all again in a heartbeat.
I thank Gary. We are indebted to him, and he did include some aircraft in that presentation, for which I am so grateful. Gary happens to be working on another one on aircraft carriers, and hopefully in the future we'll get to enjoy that. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.